Debt has a terrible reputation. From a young age, we're taught one simple rule: stay out of debt, pay off your loans. Never borrow money unless you absolutely have to. For most people, that's excellent advice. But here's the strange part. Many of the wealthiest people in the world use debt almost every single day, not because they're struggling, but because they understand the difference between good debt and bad debt. And that difference has created countless fortunes. Imagine two people each borrow $50,000. The first person buys a luxury car. The moment they drive it off the lot, it begins losing value. Every month, they make loan payments, insurance payments, maintenance payments, fuel costs. The debt costs them money. Now imagine the second person. They borrow the same $50,000, but instead of buying a car, they buy a small business, or equipment that allows them to earn more, or an investment property that produces rental income. Every month, that asset generates cash. The debt is helping create wealth. That's the difference. Bad debt buys liabilities. Good debt buys assets. The wealthy rarely borrow to consume. They borrow to produce. This concept is called leverage. Leverage allows you to control a larger asset without paying the full price up front. Think about buying a rental property. Very few investors pay cash. Instead, they make a down payment. The bank provides a rest. If the property increases in value and the rent covers a mortgage, the investor benefits from owning a much larger asset than they could have purchased outright. Used wisely, debt accelerates wealth creation. Used carelessly, it destroys it. That's why understanding debt matters more than simply avoiding it. Here's another example. Imagine a business owner can borrow $100,000 at 6% interest. They use that money to expand their business. 1 year later, the expansion produces a 20% return. After paying the interest, they've still created substantial profit. The borrowed money made them more money than it cost. That's exactly how leverage works. The key is simple. The return on the asset must exceed the cost of the debt. If it doesn't, the strategy fails. The wealthy know this. They run the numbers before borrowing. They don't rely on hope. They rely on math. Another reason wealthy people use debt is liquidity. Imagine someone owns $10 million in investments. If they need cash, selling those investments could trigger taxes. It could also mean giving up future growth. Instead, some choose to borrow against their assets. They receive cash without immediately selling their investments. Their investments continue growing while they access the money they need. This strategy isn't appropriate for everyone. It requires careful planning and carries risks if asset values fall. But it illustrates an important point. The wealthy often view debt as a financial tool, not automatically as a financial problem. Of course, leverage cuts both ways. Imagine buying a rental property. Then the housing market declines. Tenants move out. Repairs increase. Suddenly the mortgage becomes difficult to pay. Debt magnifies losses just as easily as it magnifies gains. That's why wealthy investors build safety margins. They keep emergency reserves, avoid borrowing more than they can comfortably handle, and plan for difficult economic conditions. They assume problems will happen, then prepare for them before they do. Another mistake people make is confusing all borrowing. A mortgage, a business loan, a credit card, a payday loan. These are completely different financial products. Some have relatively low interest rates. Others have extremely high costs. Treating them as identical leads to poor financial decisions. The wealthy evaluate each type separately. What does it cost? What will it buy? Will the purchase create future income? Those questions determine whether borrowing makes sense. There's another reason leverage matters. Time. Imagine saving for 20 years before buying your first investment property. Now imagine purchasing that property today using responsible financing. Your asset has 20 extra years to appreciate, 20 extra years to produce income. Time is one of the most valuable components of wealth building. Leverage allows some investors to put productive assets to work sooner, but only when the numbers make sense. The biggest misunderstanding about wealthy people and debt is this. They don't borrow because they love debt. They borrow because they love productive assets. If an asset reliably creates more value than the financing costs, debt becomes a tool. If it doesn't, they often walk away. Emotion has very little to do with the decision. Math has everything to do with it. The average consumer asks, can I afford the monthly payment? The wealthy ask, will this asset pay for itself? Those are completely different questions. One focuses on spending. The other focuses on investing. That's why two people can borrow the exact same amount of money and end up with completely different financial futures. One owes money on something that keeps losing value. The other owns something that keeps creating value. The debt looked identical. The outcome couldn't be more different. So the next time you hear someone say that all debt is bad, remember this. Debt itself isn't good or bad. It's simply a tool. And like any tool, in the wrong hands, it can cause enormous damage. But in the right hands, it can help build extraordinary wealth. The people who become financially successful don't avoid every form of debt. They simply make sure that every dollar they borrow has a job to do. And ideally, that job is making them even more money.